My soul will rejoice in the Lord. His love and compassion are faithful and pure. My soul will rejoice in the Lord.
I'll invite you to turn in your Bibles to Luke 21. We'll start there tonight just for a moment, and then we'll go back to the Old Testament. But I'd like to share with you something that happened in the life of Jesus in Luke chapter 21. Thank you for making it out tonight in the rain and in the thunder and in the lightning. I know that probably kept some people in, but it really is an encouragement when whenever I go someplace and I see people come worship God throughout the week. I know you work, I know you have school, I know there's a lot of things going on. I've noticed it's not easy to drive around Houston and just all of that. And so the fact that you're here tonight to hear the word of God and to worship just means a lot to me. So thank you for that. You know, Jesus was good at something. He was good at a lot of things, but this one particular thing he was good at, I'd like to get better at. He seemed to be able to notice things that other people didn't notice. He would see things that other people weren't watching. Here's a story like that. I'd like for you to see what happened here in chapter 21, verse 1. It says, "And he looked up, and he saw the rich putting their gifts into the treasury. And he saw a poor widow putting in 2 small copper coins. And he said, 'Truly I say to you, this poor widow put in more than all of them. For they all out of their surplus put into the offering, but she out of her poverty put in all that she had to live on.' And while some were talking about the temple, that it was adorned with beautiful stones and votive gifts, he said, 'As for these things which you are looking at, the days will come in which there will not be left one stone upon another, which will not be torn down.'" Do you notice in that reading that there's kind of a contrast between what Jesus was looking at and commenting on, and then there in verses 5 and 6, what they were looking at and commenting on? And Jesus says there in verse 6, you know, the things you're looking at, I know they're big, they're beautiful, they're flashy, but they're not going to last very long. And won't be long before not one stone will be left on another stone in this place. But how many people do you think saw the widow and noticed what she did and took from it a lesson that would live forever? You know, Jesus was observant and saw things that other people didn't see. Now that has something to do with our lesson tonight. I'll explain in a minute, but it also has something to do with times like this, nights like this. You know, I was a little bit nervous coming to this congregation just because I didn't really know anybody very well. I mean, there were a couple of people that I'd known in my past, people I'd met, but I'm always a little bit timid coming to a place, especially when you have a preacher that is well known. And I've known Don Hooten's name for like decades, you know. From the time that I was in Southern California, and I'd hear people talk about Don Hooten, and I was excited to meet him, you know, and he's a wonderful guy. But here's what's great about the family of God. It doesn't matter who you meet. They could be not known outside of this local church. Sometimes their lessons, the lessons they teach you in their life, are the most important lessons of all. It doesn't matter who the preacher is. It doesn't matter what their name is. I've heard a lot of great preachers over my life. But some of the people that had the greatest impact on me were little old ladies in the congregation where I grew up that you would never know. Nola Fleetwood, Donna Booth. People who changed my life because they just did their service and did their work the right way. You have some of that around you, don't you? I've met some of you this week. I just had dinner with a widow who's going through some hard times. But she smiles and she's joyful and she serves God and she's here. I'm going to take those kind of things away with me and not to take anything away from Dawn. But let's learn to notice that God's put around us some beautiful things that aren't always flashy. Now, what does that have to do with the lesson? We're going to go to 1 Samuel chapter 25. And we're going to talk about a woman who is largely overlooked, I think, by Bible students. Most women know about Abigail. because at some point they've had a Bible study about women, and they studied women of the Bible, and Abigail was one of those characters. But a lot of men don't really know Abigail's story very well. And I think part of the problem with Abigail's story is she is overshadowed by bigger characters. I mean, at the beginning of this chapter, Samuel dies. And the other important character in the story is David. Everybody knows David. But this woman's story, which appears in history just for a moment, God told us this story, there are so many good things to learn from her. Not just about what it means to be godly. But I'm going to go ahead and tell you this up front, and then I'm going to try to prove my case here. Abigail is actually a foreshadowing of Jesus Christ. It's not very often that a woman is a foreshadowing of Christ, but she is. She is also a foreshadowing of you as a Christian, the church. And I hope by the time we're done with the story, you'll see some of that imagery in it. But it's a beautiful story for many reasons. So let's go ahead and start to tell it. 1 Samuel chapter 25, beginning in verse 2. Now there was a man in Maon whose business was in Carmel. And the man was very rich, and he had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. And it came about while he was shearing his sheep in Carmel. Now the man's name was Nabal, and his wife's name was Abigail. And the woman was intelligent and beautiful in appearance, but the man was harsh and evil in his dealings, and he was a Calebite. That David heard in the wilderness that Nabal was shearing his sheep. So David sent 10 young men, and David said to the young men, "Go up to Carmel, visit Nabal, and greet him in my name. And you shall say, 'Have a long life. Peace be to you, and peace be to your house, and peace be to all that you have. Now I have heard that you have shearers. Now your shepherds have been with us, and we have not insulted them, nor have they missed anything all the days they were in Carmel. Ask your young men, and they will tell you. Therefore, let my young men find favor in your eyes, for we have come on a festive day. Please give whatever you find at hand to your servants and to your son David.'" Let's go back through that, kind of set the scene. We're introduced at the beginning to a man who is called very rich. You see that there in verse 2. He had 3,000 sheep and 1,000 goats. I guess that's rich. I don't have any of those, but here in Texas that might mean something. They measured wealth differently back then. But this man is very wealthy. But we also find out here that he is harsh and evil in his dealings. Down there at the end of verse 3, he was a businessman, but he might have made some of his money by being a jerk. And he is not a very good man. But we're also introduced to his wife. Now, notice how she's described there in verse 3. Abigail is described as intelligent and beautiful in appearance. Now, this isn't me getting weird. There must be a reason why the Bible tells us this. It just strikes me, when I look at this, that's pretty unique. Do you remember, men or women, it doesn't really matter. Do you remember when you were looking for somebody and you met somebody and you thought, wow, I really like to look at them. They are gorgeous. And then you sat down to talk to them and you thought, well, at least I like to look at you, that's about all they had. And then there was like that other person that you met and you loved talking to them and they challenged you and it was great conversation and you just thought, why don't you look different than you do? Now I know everybody found the whole package. I know that. But Abigail's described as being that. She's both. She's a knockout and she's smart and she's just everything. I was one of those kind of nerdy Bible kids when I was a teenager. And me and my friends, we would argue about if we could go back into the Bible and pick one woman, who would it be? And it always came down to Abigail or Abishag. But all we knew about Abishag is that she was so beautiful men would kill for her. And so I always picked Abigail. Anyway, we're going to come back to that in a minute, about why she's described in those ways. Now, it's just true about her, so it may not be any more than that. But let's keep reading in the story. David hears that on this festive day, so it probably would have been in the springtime after the sheep had been up in the mountains for the winter, and they'd come back and they were getting ready for all of the season ahead. and he was shearing off the winter coats of the sheep. And David understood that about that time, it would be appropriate for him to go send some of his guys down there and say, hey, we've been looking out for you up here. Sounds like David had this band of men. Remember yesterday in the sermon, there were 400 of them. By this time, it's grown to 600 men who were in debt and distressed and discontent. You remember David's 3D army. And he sends some of the guys down there and says, hey, tell Nabal that we've been looking out for his fellas. We've been kind of making a wall around Israel so that no cattle rustlers can come up here and steal people's stuff. And we've been good to his folks, so we deserve something here. It wasn't just that. It also would have been the law of Moses. God's law told rich people to take care of those that were poor. And so it would have been a right thing for him to do to share his goods. So David sends these men, and they're going to go talk to Nabal. Watch what happens when they arrive in verse 9. When David's young men came, they spoke to Nabal according to all these words in David's name. Then they waited. I want you to picture that for a minute. Have you ever gone up to somebody to talk to them about something maybe important, and you addressed them? You said, hey, greetings, let me talk to you. And you told them some things, you said some things to them, and they just ignored you. Can you picture that? These guys come up to Nabal, they say, greetings in the name of David, here we are, here's what we're asking, and then he makes them just stand there, kicking the dirt, looking at each other, wondering when he's going to talk. Was that 5 minutes? Was that 5 hours? I don't know. But you can kind of see how Nabal was not a very nice person, right? Just making him wait. What's he going to say when he finally speaks up? Now, before we read what Nabal says, I want to remind you of something. These men were part of that crew of David's that would not have been well thought of. They were in debt, they were distressed, they were discontent. They were not necessarily righteous men. And the reason they were living out in the wilderness is they'd kind of run away from their life and their problems. And they're standing right here on your property, asking for your money. What would you say? Look what Nabal says. Verse 10. Nabal answered David's servants and said, who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? There are many servants today who are each breaking away from his master. Shall I then take my bread and my water and my meat that I've slaughtered for my shearers and give it to men whose origin I do not know? So David's young men retraced their way and went back, and they came and told him according to all these words. David said to his men, each of you gird on his sword. So each man girded on his sword, and David also girded on his sword. And about 400 men went up behind David, while 200 stayed with the baggage. All right, did you catch Nabal? When Nabal finally looks at these fellas, he says, who is David? And who is the son of Jesse? Remember, they greeted him in David's name. Now, let me tell you what Nabal does not mean. Nabal does not mean, I've never heard of David. That's not what he means. Everybody had heard of David. Remember the story last night? He was in the land of the Philistines, in Gath. They'd never seen a picture of him and they recognized him. They'd heard the songs about him. There's no way in the world Nabal's not heard of David. We're going to find out in a minute. Abigail knows about David. She knows about Goliath. Nabal has heard of David. Do you know what he means by saying, who is David? He means, who is he to me? Why should I care that he's here? Now, let me go back to what I was asking you a minute ago. If these were guys standing on your property asking for your money, what would you say? Because it sounds fairly reasonable, doesn't it, for Nabal to say, hey, I don't know where you're from. I don't know your story. You expect me to take my money and my food and give it to men whose origins I don't know? You get lost. I'm not helping you. I grew up in San Diego, California. And there's a lot of homeless people there. Do you know that? By the way, if I'm ever homeless, look for me in San Diego, because that's a great place to live. You can live outside. People give you money and food. I struggled with this, though, I'd see people all the time asking for money. Now, I want to be clear about this. I don't believe the Bible teaches that we're to just give money to anybody at any time. Remember, these guys had done a service, had done a work. There was something going on with that. But there's a lot of times when I would look at people asking for help, and here's what I would think. You only need help because you've made a mess of your own life. You're here because you've made bad decisions. And there's a lot of people out here that are taking advantage of people, and you're going to expect me to give to you? I want to remind you of something. If that's the natural way you think, that's the spirit of Nabal. Do you know what the spirit of Jesus is? Give to him who asks of you, expecting nothing in return. That's what our Lord taught. He didn't talk about being calculating and finding out every detail. There's a spirit of people that when they see someone in need, their heart goes out to them. That's how God was with us. But the spirit of Nabal talks like this, and I just want you to remember that next time you're wondering about how to be generous or not. By the way, David doesn't seem to think that's a reasonable response, does he? Because when they get back to where David's at and tell them what he said, David says, grab your swords. He grabs his sword, and 400 guys take off towards Nabal's house. I mean, there's about to be like a showdown at Nabal's corral. This is not going to be good. Now watch what happens back home, back at Nabal's place in verse 14. One of the young men told Abigail, Nabal's wife, saying, behold, David sent messengers from the wilderness to greet our master, and he scorned them. Yet the men were very good to us, and we were not insulted, nor did we miss anything as long as we went about with them while we were in the fields. They were a wall to us both by night and by day, all the time we were with them tending the sheep. Now therefore know and consider what you should do, for evil is plotted against our master and against all his household, and he is such a worthless man that no one can speak to him. There's something really interesting about what's happening back at Nabal's house. When these men run off and the servants hear what happened, they go running to the one place in the house they can find help. And it's not to Nabal, it's to Abigail. Think about what that says of her. Fathers, in your house, I'm a dad, and I just wonder, when my kids really need something solved, when there's really a problem, when there's a mess going on, who is it that they talk to? Now, I'm certainly not against them going to mom, but I sure hope it doesn't sound like when they go to mom something like this. Mom, we need some help, and we can't talk to dad because he's a scoundrel. Isn't that crazy? How bad did Nabal have to be for the servants in the house to say to the wife of the house, he's so worthless none of us can talk to him? And she doesn't reprimand them. She just knows it's true. This is a bad scene in this house, isn't it? Now, the servant says something to Abigail I want you to think about. Know and consider what you should do. Hey, here's a problem. How are we going to fix it? Abigail is very smart. I want you to see what she decides to do. And then we're going to make some comments up to this point in the story. Look at verse 18. Abigail hurried and took 200 loaves of bread and 2 jugs of wine and 5 sheep already prepared and 5 measures of roasted grain and 100 clusters of raisins and 200 cakes of figs and loaded them on donkeys. She said to her young men, go on before me. Behold, I am coming after you. But she did not tell her husband Nabal. And came about as she was riding on her donkey and coming down by the hidden part of the mountain, that behold, David and his men were coming down towards her. So she met them. Now David had said, surely in vain I have guarded all that this man has in the wilderness, so that nothing was missed of all that belonged to him. And he has returned me evil for good. May God do so to the enemies of David, and more also, if by morning I leave as much as one male of any who belong to him. All right, Abigail, know and consider what you should do. What does she do? Well, she sort of turns into my grandma and she starts cooking, right? Like she just makes food. If there's ever a problem, make food. Actually, this is brilliant, isn't it? There's 400 guys carrying swords, send food. It's really hard to fight with chicken legs in your hand, you know? Like, if these guys are eating, they're not fighting. But she sends food ahead and comes after the food to see if it softens them up a bit. Just a quick lesson about that. The New Testament in the book of Titus tells Christians to be ready for every good deed. Have you ever thought about that phrase, be ready for every good deed? Abigail lived in a time where there weren't refrigerators or freezers. How did she come up with a meal like this? Like, what kind of woman did she have to be that sort of in a moment she could feed an army? This is somebody who thought about generosity. This is somebody who thought about the way that they ran their life. I know Christians like this. I mean, they literally buy food and keep it stocked so that if somebody comes into their place and they need a meal, they can say, come with us, we'll feed you. They keep a room ready in their house for somebody for hospitality. They set aside money every week or every month just in case somebody needs help. Abigail's an example of being ready for every good deed. Let's stop here and let's make some applications. First thing I want you to think about is how crazy it is that these two people are married. Have you ever wondered about how different these two were? I mean, he is awful and she is wonderful. You ever met a married couple like that? I mean, I know you have. We all have, right? Like the wife is sweet and kind and gentle, and the husband is just as ornery as he can be. And it's not always like that. Sometimes the man is gentle and kind and generous, and the woman's mean as a snake. You ever wondered how two people like that ended up together? All right, let's go through the options. Maybe Abigail and Nabal were married when they were both evil. Like they were both party animals and did whatever they wanted, and they fell in love. And then, at some point, Abigail decided she was going to be what she should. She's going to do right. You ever seen that happen? Two unbelievers, they get married, and one of them at some point says, I'm going to follow God. Is that complicated? Always, isn't it? I mean, the one that isn't serving God is like, hey, I didn't sign on for this. And the one that is serving God looks back and says, but I really want you to come with me. Sometimes people in those situations just give up. That's one option. Here's the second option. Maybe Abigail and Nabal got married when they were both good. Maybe they both served God at the beginning. And at some point, Nabal, with greed in his heart and in his figuring out business, he decided to become dishonest and a jerk. And he gave up on God. You ever seen that? Two people marry as Christians, and one of them says, I'm out, I'm done. You know how excruciating that is? You know how difficult it is for the one who's righteous to not think in terms of, hey, this isn't fair. I didn't sign on for this. You lied to me and you lied to God, and I don't deserve to be in this situation anymore. But there's a third option here. And it's probably most likely what happened. And that is, Nabal and Abigail probably had an arranged marriage. In fact, literally, just now when I pulled into the parking lot, I got a video call from a friend of mine in India. He's getting married in 4 hours. He didn't pick this woman. They're both Christians, but they've got an arranged marriage. And he wants me to pray for him. You think? Like, that's complicated. Just imagine Abigail's parents picking Nabal in the honeymoon period, and she looks at who she wakes up next to and she thinks, why did my parents put me in this mess? But that would make it even more difficult, wouldn't it, to say, I didn't even choose this. I mean, in the other situations, you might say, well, I made my bed, I got a lie in it, it was my decision, I was the fool. But here she could have said, this wasn't even my fault. Do you know what I love about Abigail? she doesn't just run away. I mean, think about it, women. I mean, if this is your husband and somebody comes to you and says, hey, somebody's coming to take off his head, don't you think something like, well, my, God works in mysterious ways. It's time to go visit my sister. Like, all you got to do is back up and let the thing come down. But the Bible teaches something about godliness. Proverbs 31 speaks of the woman who's worth something and says, the heart of her husband safely trusts in her. She does him good, not evil, all the days of his life. I admire righteous people who swear to their own hurt and do not change. Who make a promise and say they're going to do something, and no matter what or how difficult it gets, they do it no matter the cost. And they don't look for the easy way out. I grew up across the street from Tom and Linda. They weren't godly people, but they had 2 children, Tommy and Monica. They were my playmates. They were my friends. Tom, the dad, was a contractor. He made a lot of money. He had a big, house and all kinds of neat stuff, and it seemed like the perfect family. One day, Linda started getting sick. And before long, she was so sick, she had to be in a wheelchair. She lost her eyesight. She couldn't communicate. I think it was muscular dystrophy or something like that. Wasn't very long before Tommy and Monica, the 2 kids, started showing the same symptoms. They had to ride tricycles, not bicycles. We had to play softball with a ball that would beep because they couldn't see it. And it wasn't very long before all 3 of them were in wheelchairs. I was just a boy. But I woke up one day and Tom, the dad, was gone. He had just left. And there were 3 people in that house just wasting away. Now, to his credit, he let him live there. And Linda's parents came to take care of him. And he'd show up to check on the house every once in a while with his cute new wife and his big fancy truck. And I hated him. How do you do that? How do you walk out and run away? You see, God measures things very different than we do. He doesn't look at us and think, what do you deserve? And that you're in a situation that you should be willing, or I'll be fine if you just walk away from. No, God looks at strength differently. I mean, if you took Abigail's story into our modern world and said, here's this beautiful, kind, smart woman married to an absolute moron of a man who's unkind, what should she do? People would say, leave him, kick him to the curb. Womanly strength means move on. And God says no. You do what's right. And you be patient. Abigail is tremendous, isn't she? That she does what's right by him. Proverbs chapter 13. I want you to just look at this proverb for a minute. Proverbs chapter 13, verse 12. The proverb says, hope deferred makes the heart sick, but desire fulfilled is a tree of life. You ever thought about that verse much? Hope, if you have a hope that's deferred, meaning it's not coming to fruition. I hope to get married. I hope to get well. I hope to have children. I hope my husband comes to the Lord. I hope my wife comes to the Lord. I hope my kids return from the world. You have a hope, but it's deferred. Here's what the reality of your life is. You have a sick heart. You always do, because you're just waiting for hope to come to fruition. But a desire fulfilled is a tree of life. When the day finally comes where the thing that you hoped for happens, man, life changes and explodes. There's all kinds of ways to apply this verse. For me and my wife, the way it really made sense was we had infertility issues for years. We didn't think we'd ever have kids. We kept trying. They weren't coming. And we prayed and wished and hoped and did everything we could think to do to have them. And that hope deferred broke my wife's heart, and it broke my heart to watch her. By the way, just for what it's worth, if you have people around you that can't have children, be careful how you talk about getting pregnant and having kids. Because, it always happened. Somebody that had 4 kids would get pregnant, and they'd say, man, we're pregnant again. And we go home and cry on our pillow at night and say, God, why do you keep giving them to people that don't want them? We'll take them. But some of you understand this verse a different way. You were the one married to somebody who wasn't budging. They weren't coming. They weren't going to serve God. And you hoped they would. Up there in Minnesota, her name is Vicki Weiniger. Vicki is one of the most godly women I know. Raised 2 boys to love the Lord. Right in front of her husband, who was a doctor and way too smart to believe in God. But because of her faithfulness and because of her patience and because of her kindness, the day finally came, just a few years ago, that Dave Weiniger showed up. And he started to listen. And he obeyed the gospel. And a couple of weeks ago, he stood up in front of the congregation, and he's one of our deacons now. You ought to see Vicky's face. It's a tree of life. Don't give up. Never give up while they're still alive. If Abigail could look at Nabal and think, well, he's worth saving, then you remember her story. Go back to the story in 1 Samuel chapter 25. Now the food is on its way to the army. Abigail's behind the food on her animal. I want to ask you women a question. Do you suppose Abigail was timid or nervous about this time? Can you even imagine that? Heading off toward an army of men who are so mad in a time where women probably shouldn't be the ones talking to these guys. And you're going to have the boldness, the crazy thought that you're going to go stand in front of an army and appease them? Do you think her heart is in her throat? Is she taking her life into her own hands? What do you think she expects to happen here? Watch what she does. Verse 23 says, when Abigail saw David, she hurried and dismounted from her donkey and fell on her face before David and bowed herself to the ground. She fell at his feet and said, on me alone, my Lord, be the blame. And please, let your maidservant speak to you and listen to the words of your maidservant. Please do not let my Lord pay attention to this worthless man, Nabal, for as his name is, so is he. Nabal is his name, and folly is with him. But I, your maidservant, did not see the young man of my Lord whom you sent. Now therefore, my Lord, as the Lord lives and as your soul lives, since the Lord has restrained you from shedding blood and from avenging yourself by your own hand, now then, let your enemies and those who seek evil against my Lord be as Nabal. Now, let this gift which your maidservant has brought to my Lord be given to the young men who accompany my Lord. Please, forgive the transgression of your maidservant. For the Lord will certainly make for my Lord an enduring house, because my Lord is fighting the battles of the Lord. And evil will not be found in you all of your days. Should anyone rise up to pursue you and to seek your life, then the life of my Lord shall be bound in the bundle of the living with the Lord your God. But the lives of your enemies he will sling out as from the hollow of a sling. And when the Lord does for my Lord according to all the good that he has spoken concerning you, and appoints you ruler over Israel, this will not cause grief or a troubled heart to my Lord, both by having shed blood without cause, and by my Lord having avenged himself. When the Lord deals well with my Lord, then remember your maidservant. What impresses you about that scene? She gets there. She gets off her animal. By the way, did you notice how many times it says Abigail hurried? She hurried. She hurried and made food. She hurried and got off the animal. She did things quickly. She moved with purpose, and she meant what she was doing. She lays down in the dirt on her face, and she begins to speak. And what does she say? Well, it's filled with humility. She calls herself maidservant 6 times. She calls David Lord 14 times. She's brilliant. She reminds David of his future. God wants to put you somewhere, and if you do this thing, what are you going to be when you get there? She reminds David of his past with that reference to the enemies and the sling. Did you catch that? What is she talking about? Do you remember you killed Goliath, David? But I'll tell you what impresses me most. I'm going to be really honest with you about this. I don't like what she says here. It makes me upset. When she says in verse 24, "On me alone, my Lord, be the blame." I don't like that. Don't say that. That's not you. That's not your fault. You didn't do anything wrong. What do you mean on you be the blame? That's not fair. If justice is going to be served, you put the blame where it belongs. But to stand in front of some guys that want blood and say, "Blame me," no, that's not right. And folks, that's not nearly as good as what she says in verse 28. In verse 28, she says, "Please forgive the transgression of your maidservant." What transgression? What did she do? She did nothing wrong. Why is she speaking as if she's got sin? Do you recognize her? This is where Abigail is Jesus. She steps between the guilty and the justice and says, "Me, not them." In fact, I'll go ahead and say it so clearly that I'll say it's my sin to take. You see, godly people figured something out long before God ever brought the cross. They knew that the love of God meant that you take the blame, that you show mercy, that you are somebody's advocate. I mean, it goes all the way back to the first times in the Bible when Moses was leading the children of Israel out of Israel, and God said, "Step aside, I want to kill them." And Moses stood in between them and said, "Take me, not them." That's the spirit of Jesus. What if this was real in marriages? I mean, what if this was real in churches? Then when things were going wrong, instead of everybody pointing fingers, somebody said, "Me, I'll take the blame. It's my sin. Let's clear this up and get it right." I know what somebody's going to say. But it's not true. It's not honest. Yeah, that's the thing about mercy. Mercy doesn't make any sense. Mercy is the sacrifice of everything that we hold dear as Christians. It's the sacrifice of justice. If justice is going to be served, it's got to be served. No, you see, God's a God of mercy. And you don't want justice for you, do you? You want mercy. Let me point out something else here. Proverbs 27:17 says, "As iron sharpens iron, so one man sharpens another." Now, in this case, it's a woman sharpening a man, but catch this. Abigail's the only one in this story doing the right thing. Her husband is not doing the right thing. The rightful king of Israel is not doing the right thing. I mean, there's nobody doing the right thing here. Do you know what most people say about that? "Hey, I'm young. All the adults around me aren't doing really the right things. Why should I?" Well, where I work, everybody's wrong. And they all speak this way. I mean, we always come up with the excuse that we don't have any support. And yet, here she is, all by herself. The government's not doing it right. Her family's not doing it right. And there she stands, doing the right thing. What do you think is going on with David? Like, can you imagine being David, watching this woman come up and fall in the dirt? I'm going to suggest something to you. That when she did that, David grabbed his sword. Now, that's speculation. But I bet you he grabbed his sword and the other guys grabbed their swords and they probably had their fists gripped tight, ready to strike. Because listen to what he says. Verse 32. Then David said to Abigail, "Blessed be the Lord God of Israel who sent you this day to meet me. And blessed be your discernment, and blessed be you who have kept me this day from bloodshed and from avenging myself by my own hand. Nevertheless, as the Lord God of Israel lives, who has restrained me from harming you, unless you had come quickly to meet me, surely there would not have been left to Nabal until the morning light as much as one male." So David received forth from her hand what she had brought him, and said to her, "Go up to your house in peace. See, I have listened to you and granted your request." Did you catch that? David said two things. One, Abigail, you've restrained me from harming the people over there, but God's restrained me from harming you. That has to mean that he was thinking about it and he was ready to do it, and something, somehow, whether God stilled his hand or he opened his ears long enough to hear the first few lines of the speech, God kept David from killing her. But I'll tell you what I really like. Did you see who David blessed first? Look at verse 32. "Blessed be the Lord God, who sent you this day to meet me." Now, folks, you're reading the same story I am. Did you see anywhere in the story where God told Abigail to go? I mean, did God show up and say, "Abigail, go save David. Go save your husband"? How could David say that God sent her? I think we get afraid sometimes to sound like maybe denominational people with the way we talk. But isn't that the right thing to say? It didn't have to be a miracle to give God the credit. Anytime somebody does what's right, do you know who gets the credit for that? God. Every time. You wouldn't have thought of that on your own. Abigail didn't know how to be this person without the law of God and the teaching of God. God always gets the credit, and we need to learn to speak like this. Could I say rightly, "Blessed be God who sent you this night to hear me"? Could I say that? Somebody would object. No, God didn't send me. Sure he did. You knew it was right to be here. Everything that he programmed in you, in your heart, in your mind, everything he taught you, it got you here. And we need to learn to give credit where credit's due. But David says, "Go in peace." Watch what happens when Abigail gets home. Verse 36. Abigail came to Nabal, and behold, he was holding a feast in his house like the feast of a king. And Nabal's heart was merry within him, for he was very drunk. So she did not tell him anything at all until the morning light. But in the morning, when the wine had gone out of Nabal, his wife told him these things. And his heart died within him, so that he became as a stone. About 10 days later, the Lord struck Nabal, and he died. Now, women, I'm going to go back to asking you, if you'd gone through a day like this, you prepared all the food, you rode your animal, you laid in the dirt, you said the words, the army turned around and left, do you think she cried some tears? Do you think she rode her way back just tired? And she gets home and Nabal's drunk again. He has no idea what she's done for him. So ungrateful. You know what a lot of women would have done? Walked up, slapped him in the back of the head. "Do you know what I did for you again? Do you know that I saved your neck again?" Sounds like to me she just goes to bed that night. And what David said to her about going in peace, I just get the sense that she had a sense of peace about it. There's a lesson in this. Doing the right thing is reward enough. Some of you will serve all your life for a spouse that never says thank you. They'll never say it. Sleep well at night. God sees. You may pour yourself out in ways that nobody knows. I hope you sleep good knowing that God sees. Now, I don't know what happened to Nabal when she told him and it says that his heart turned to stone. I don't get all of that. But 10 days later, God did what Abigail would not do. God said, vengeance is mine, I will repay. She didn't take it into her own hands, but God did. I had a friend growing up in California. Her mom was in a tough situation. The dad was just a Nabal. He was just such an evil man. He'd buy this girl drugs. He'd pay for her abortions. Just wrecked this girl. They went to a big enough church that they could kind of hide, One day that man just died in his sleep. Didn't wake up. And I'll never forget the preacher that preached his funeral got up and told this story and said everybody knew he was a Nabal. Now, what's the point of this lesson? I am not up here telling you that if you wait long enough, God's going to rub your spouse out. That's not what I'm telling you. That's not the point. I want you to remember that Abigail waited on God. She did. And God took care of it. Now, if you're on the other side of this, and there's somebody here that probably is, your parents, your spouse, your friends have been trying to reach you. They've been good to you. They've shown you good examples. They've loved you. They've reached out to you. And you've been stubborn. And you've been selfish. And you've pushed back. And you've kept your ungodly attitude. Will you please listen to me? You better figure it out. Because one day God's going to figure it out for you. Do you remember how this story ends? In the next couple of verses, David hears that Nabal is dead. And David says, God's avenged me. And David remembers Abigail, which is exactly what she asked for. I don't know if that was like a veiled sort of proposal or what. But earlier she had said, hey, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And David remembers her, and he sends for her, and she comes, and Abigail becomes a queen, the wife of a king. Isn't that fitting? Didn't she seem to be the kind of woman that should belong to a king? But see, folks, this is where Abigail is the foreshadowing of us. She's not just Christ, she's the church. Because someday, if you do what's right and you don't give up, you too one day will marry the king. We'll be the bride of Christ. I want you to remember the story of Abigail, the foreshadowing of all of us and our Savior, but just the tremendous character of this woman. Thanks for your attention tonight. If you've not obeyed the gospel or you need our prayers tonight, however we can help you spiritually, please let us know while we stand and sing this song together.
My soul will rejoice in the Lord. His love and compassion are faithful and pure. My soul will rejoice in the Lord.